it seems to me like this whole thing, the post-World War II era of U.S. naval dominance of the seas, which established the safety of these ocean lanes, like that's coming to an end, which means that all of the world's economies are going to have to be recalibrated to this. It actually means more localization of economies, which means you lose those price efficiencies. And so everything's going to become more expensive.
So you can start to see how, there's different control networks that are being disassembled across the necessity for sea lanes now, but who can control the food in that new greater Israel area that you were talking about? Imagine if it was a food growing zone as well as an oil export area combined into one. Like what kind of power and wealth could that generate for those areas?
Well, this really shows
to restructure and reset up a new economy. The new fourth turning begins in Africa this time.
Wow. His channel is called Adapt 2030. He joins me today to talk about world events and with some surprises that will shock you. Welcome, David. It's great to have you back on the show today. I want to talk about also what's coming in 2024. In your view, what we're looking at, because it seems like so many events are aligning to shape 2024 to be the most difficult year of our lifetimes, probably. And, in so many ways, but how about this? Let's start with what's happening in the Red Sea with the 6 largest shipping container companies on the planet now banning all transport through the Red Sea, which means the Suez Canal also, because of course the Houthi rebel attacks on the cargo ships. This is stemming from Israel's continued bombing of Palestinians in Gaza, which is angering the Yemeni people, causing these attacks on the ships. I mean, it's all interrelated, folks. But David, talk to us about what this means for global supply chains of food and fertilizer and anything related to being able to sustain our lives day to day, even in the West.
That's where a vast amount of control comes in. And you've heard, these power brokers through the ages talk about having food to control the masses. Controlling a world economy is one thing, but controlling food to then control the people is something on a whole different level. So think about all these things and they're interplaying. Are you telling me really that naval forces just let the Yemenis continue to escalate and escalate and escalate without getting there, although they had forces there to stop Somali pirates back in the day, that nobody lifted a finger after the first or second incident? They let it go on for weeks and weeks, and now we gotta. It's almost as if it was done on purpose to allow it to run to that apex where they knew that would be the outcome. That insurers would stop insuring vessels, and it would guarantee they ran around the Cape of Good Hope. Right. Well, yeah, there goes your global warming right there. Is anybody from the Fortune 500s that's supporting all the green agendas going to suddenly, shut their mouths for a minute because they need to run an extra 2 weeks of dirty bunker fuel around the bottom part of our planet so they can continue to sell their trinkets of junk? But the thing is, coming into the planting season, an enormous amount of companies, individuals, farmers, co-ops are getting ready to get their implements, their repair parts, the things they might need for fertilizers inbound right now in the supply chain to get ready for the planting season. This is going to delay it or disrupt it completely. So you got to think about how much food can be disrupted. Not only the ability to get things into the farmer's hands to grow it in the fields, but then for that processing to take that to a factory and then put it in whatever, a box, a bottle, plastic container, and then ship that elsewhere. I mean, you're talking about multiple delays on multiple fronts, all just revolving around food.
Today, the demand for gold continues to flourish globally. History proves that fiat paper money is designed to go to zero through inflation, whereas gold has intrinsic value in which it maintains forever. Paper money is a debt instrument. Gold is an asset of wealth in its own right. It does not depend upon any governments, corporations, or individuals' promise to repay. ITM Trading has spent the last 27 plus years developing a team of expert researchers and analysts to make this possible. Simply put, we build strategies which are historically proven to protect your wealth and assets through any economic downturn or currency collapse. Schedule your free gold and silver strategy call 866-834-1422. That's 866-834-1422, or go to learn.itmtrading.com/MIAC.
And then what's that? The second largest of electronics componentry part maker on the planet says they're looking at a 40 week delay now.
Oh,
so
Schneider?
they say
You're talking
20
about
if
Schneider?
it's not, if it's not engineered component part that you're doing something specialty, but if it's just
Right.
off the shelf, 20 weeks, if you need something done that would be specific for you, it's 40 weeks.
Well, let me interrupt right there for a second.
There's a lot of components, and you'd know more about it in the farming industry because you have some tractors. Like, what kind of electronics are involved in the modern tractor that if that 20 or 40 week delay on parts, how's that going to affect the machinery in the fields?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're dead in the water. I mean, a modern tractor is a very high-tech instrument, much more high-tech than an automobile typically. And these tractors have a lot of sensors, and the sensors, they're programmed to shut down if the sensor senses a problem with, for example, the emissions control system. So, a lot of these tractors have a diesel emission fluid, right? DEF. I mean, I think almost all of them at this point because they're all diesel. And if your DEF sensor goes bad, it might be a $25 part, but your $200,000 tractor is offline for 6 months because that part can't be sourced. And that has happened to people. We've actually covered that before. But that's an example of it because the government's forced the tractor manufacturers to make sure the engine won't run without DEF in there. And again, if the sensor breaks, the tractor thinks you don't have any. So we're talking about very highly vulnerable, highly complex systems that rely on these complex supply chains, which relies on the U.S. Navy to secure the safety of these shipping routes, and the Navy can't do it, as the Houthi rebels are proving. All it takes is a few $1,000s worth of drones and a couple of low-tech rockets, and you shut down half the global supply chain right there.
And I saw there's a Twitter channel called Iran Observer, and they were pointing out yesterday that now Malaysia is putting out the word that anything that's to or from Israel bound cargo ship, anything, even if you have one container heading to Israel on your ship and 99.999% is even going somewhere else, even one container on one ship heading that they can find on a manifest that they're no longer allowed to transit through Malaysian waters or dock or port berth in Malaysia.
Wow. I did not know
that's
that.
a huge one too. Now, if Indonesia does a thing, I was looking at some maps. I got some maritime, interoperable maps there. So if Indonesia decides to do the same thing, they're going to overlap on territorial waters a little bit south and to the east of Singapore, which means there would be no transit route.
Wow.
None.
See, and
if Indonesia follows the same scheme, then that blocks off the Malacca Strait completely for anything in or outbound from Israel at that point.
right. See, that's okay. What you're talking about is extraordinary because I mean the entire global system of food and consumer goods and textiles and electronics is based on a highly efficient, reliable ocean transit. The entire system. I mean, this is why you have food that's grown or produced in America, like chicken meat, and it's shipped to China for processing, and then it's shipped back to America for retailing. I mean, how could that be? Well, it's because of the efficiency of these ocean supply lines. And that's vanishing. And David, I'm sure you're watching this, the congregation of U.S. naval vessels in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean, in the Persian Gulf, for God's sake, sailing right by Iran through the Strait of Hormuz, almost like begging, nuke us or bomb us. It's almost begging to try to provoke a war. Well, what does this do about then China and Taiwan, right? How can the Navy defend Taiwan if all the Navy is in the freaking Red Sea? I mean, do the math.
Depends on how engaged China wants to be to go after the island.
Yeah. Well, what do you
And then
think
what is that?
gonna
You know,
happen?
Tinian, they're going back over to dust off a few of the old air bases in Tinian to put out a second ring off there, you know, from Guam down to the Marianas there. So look for the U.S. Navy and also our Air Force. They're refurbishing the runways. I saw the Seabees were out there cutting a bunch of new roads around Tinian. And just there's some amazing, archaeological artifacts there on Tinian that don't make sense, like megaliths, seriously large megaliths. And then also the air bases. You know, it only have to extend the runways a little while. I didn't realize that the size of the runways that they put there in the 1940s could accommodate almost every one of the aircraft we have now, except for like the long-range B-52 bombers or something. But, you know, they're re-inhabiting? You got that first ring there with Taiwan and the Philippines and Japan, and then you got the second ring of defense there in the Marianas and Guam all the way down to Tinian. And then it's almost as if we're starting to retake the islands again as in World War II. What's next? Guadalcanal? Are we going to set up something there to try to prevent movement of goods across through the islands? And if you can control those different rings of island heading in and out of, you know, the Asian coast there, then,
Right.
you know, the same thing happens. So whatever country controls it will then be able to dictate the economy of at least that part of the world.
You've nailed it. Exactly, right there. Whatever country controls those sea lanes will be able to dictate exports and imports, which means manufacturing and domestic GDP. So China, of course, is asserting its naval power with massive infrastructure of the construction of naval vessels. According to a recent report, China actually has 200 times more dry dock capacity than does the United States. It is astonishing, 200 times greater. And they are churning out, as factories, churning out all these naval vessels. And they intend to completely dominate that area of the world, those waters. And you can't control that with air power alone. I mean, you're talking about the runways for air power, but as you know, air power alone can't control the waters. Only a Navy can control the waters. And the U.S. Navy is probably going to get itself, nuked or attacked over in the Middle East. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at this point, David, if we lose an aircraft carrier. I'm serious. It's almost like the Pentagon is begging Iran to sink an aircraft carrier.
Yeah, there's one of those 4 over there now that is stationed to go into decommission 5 years from now anyway. I forget which one it is, but that would be, if I was just guessing, saying, optimal loss for most involvement into the conflict. It's going to dry dock anyway. They're going to spend how many billions, because how much toxic removal will be required for hazmat teams to get in there and remove an enormous amount of whatever. Just, let one of those Sunburn or Onyx missiles run into it. And that would be another way to draw a huge amount of Americans' support for an intervention over there, because almost everybody I know, doesn't matter where they sit, they're like, that's a very bad idea to get bogged down now with Iran. The oil's going to go up in price. Everything's already expensive, going to get more expensive. I mean, that's just like Charlie Foxtrot times 10 to get in there and do that on purpose. But if a carrier gets sunk and all the boys died, and, something is probably going to stick out of the ocean a little bit, because I think it's only a couple hundred feet deep running through some of the channels there, but our carriers are 1,000 feet long. So can you imagine that? It would probably be some kind of war memorial as well. It'd be sticking out of the sea, rally around the thing there. And you just wonder how much of it's on purpose, because I'm absolutely saying that those attacks on the merchant vessels were allowed to continue unabated, untested, unchecked to get us to this point. And now, is it all about control of the food supply? Because I really bring it back to, okay, oil's one thing, economy's another. But if you can absolutely dominate and control the world's food supply, the movement of it, the sale of it, who gets it, who doesn't get it, I mean, that's one of the most powerful plays, if you're looking at a global chessboard, is food control for the world populace.
Yeah. Well, I would say, the two big things there are food and energy, right? So, as you mentioned, oil, but also natural gas exports. And right now, with the Suez Canal essentially being, largely blocked, you have to wonder about energy exports to Europe that are coming out of places like, Qatar, right? And how much liquid natural gas is actually transported through the Strait of Hormuz. I think it's something like 30% of all the exports in the world go through the Strait of Hormuz. And you're right. I feel this is starting to feel to me like Pearl Harbor, where the U.S. military allowed the attack on Pearl Harbor. They knew it was going to happen. They almost sort of, begged for it. They provoked it. And they made sure that key ships were not in the harbor, but the ones that got destroyed were the ones that needed a lot of repairs anyway, or that were close to being decommissioned, right? And then, of course, a few thousand U.S. servicemen and women were killed at Pearl Harbor. And so the American people got behind the whole war in the Pacific, which before that did not have American support. This feels exactly the same to me. This is a modern day Pearl Harbor to get the American people to support war with Iran. And this is all about expanding Israel to greater Israel, which you've seen the maps. They want to take over half of Saudi Arabia, most of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, probably part of Egypt by the time we're done with this. I mean, Israel wants to control the energy and the water. We haven't talked about water yet, but the greater Israel map is about 40% of all the water resources in the Middle East, by the way. And that, as you know, has everything to do with food and agriculture. So what are your thoughts on everything I just said right there?
They need to toss in the wild card, the new Renaissance Dam. And I was just reading Sudan and Eritrea, Ethiopia, they couldn't agree on the electricity distribution or the irrigation distribution that was coming off of that. Because in addition to the new Renaissance Dam, they have a step down coming off the plateau there of 3 more large dams. They're not going to be as large as the new Renaissance Dam, but very large in comparison to continue to generate electricity. So that'll be a hub for new manufacturing in Africa when this new era of history begins. We're in the reset now.
Hold on.
So
where is this dam?
Itself,
where would this dam be constructed? The new Renaissance
It's already
dam.
been constructed. It's the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa right now. It was supposed to take 7 years to fill, but it filled in 2 years. So somebody knew the hydrological patterns were going to change in advance.
Okay, but
this is in Ethiopia right now.
Oh, that's in Ethiopia. Okay, all right. Sorry, I was not familiar with that dam, but I want our audience to understand the implications, geographically of what you're talking about. So
So now, who in their right mind would build the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa in one of the driest places in Africa, unless you knew the shift was on in the West African monsoon or something on a multi-thousand-year cycle that was going to green the Sahel again. And water resources come in 2 forms in Africa. We got the below ground water resources, which would include the Nubian sandstone aquifer and the Sousse aquifer along in Morocco. And look at all the aquifers that go through the Sahel region. If you were going to couple the below ground water resources with the above ground precipitation increases due to this shift on a multi-thousand-year cycle, we're talking about a new food growing zone.
Right.
And also with the new hydro dams there, you have all the electricity you need now to bring Africa into and become a world leader in manufacturing, processing, et cetera, because you would have stable power. And that's the whole thing about the countries up in the Northeast couldn't agree on how much power was delivered because everybody wants that power. To have reliable power means you have a reliable economy, and they can see it too. There's no low power, wealthy economies. Let's say if you're looking at a scatter graph somewhere, none, zero on the planet.
No, you have to have power. But I want to get back to this. So you're talking about a climate shift in terms of increased rainfall in that region. But what about the Middle East? What does the same projection show about increased rainfall in areas, like Jordan or Syria or Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, over the last few years, you'll start to see that they are getting much greener. And you can go to a NASA Earth Viewer and take a look at previous years and see the vegetation index on how that's changing across the area. But if I could take you back in time to circa 800 AD, if we go into Yemen, there was an area there called the Marib Dam, M-A-R-I-B, and it was the largest freshwater reservoir in the entire Middle East. That was in 800 AD. So these precipitation patterns come and go. And all the frankincense trees that were grown there on the frankincense root have those massive 100 square miles of frankincense trees growing in what is now bone-dry desert. That shift occurred quite quickly. It was pretty much drying out within a couple hundred years on that shift. So if we're heading back into it, and then it could be a more rapid shift in the onset period, then this becomes very, very valuable real estate for a lot of agriculture and energy both. Because again, controlling the world, you need the food and you need the oil or the energy. Now imagine if you, in the reset, the Great Reset they keep talking about, is consolidating food production centers areas into one. So that way we don't have to worry about these global conflicts. We don't have to worry about regional conflicts. If we, the great leaders of the WEF, can bottle everything into one area on the planet and grow all the world's food in just one single area, and then we can distribute it for you, and we can take back all the farmland and turn it back into forests. And this, I think, has something to do with the plan. I don't have all the information, but it seems like it fits in.
Global central control over the food supply also. So all of humanity becomes enslaved and subject to the terms of food distribution.
That's it. You and I both talked to Andy Sheckman, and that they have definitely completed a new rail section going through Kazakhstan right now. So their rail routes from China through Kazakhstan all the way over into Russia has just jumped up a level plus. So you can start to see how, there's different control networks that are being disassembled across the necessity for sea lanes now. But who can control the food in that new greater Israel area that you were talking about? Imagine if it was a food growing zone as well as an oil export area combined into one. Like, what kind of power and wealth could that generate for those areas?
Well, this really shows...
To restructure and reset up a new economy. The new fourth turning begins in Africa this time.
Wow. Okay. So Israel is clearly desperate to take Gaza, and of course his offshore discoveries of a massive amount of natural gas and other energy resources. It's also believed that the proposed Ben Gurion Canal, which would connect the Red Sea to the Mediterranean through Israel, and it goes right through Gaza. The plan does, and so they need to take Gaza in order to build that canal. That would free up Israel from having to depend on the Suez Canal controlled by Egyptians. And then you mentioned the railways that being constructed, Belt and Road Initiative from China. But as you know, David, transport is about 100 times more expensive on land than it is by sea. And so the sea lanes are the most critical channels for nations to be able to achieve economic growth, which translates into military power and, geopolitical power. The sea lanes are where it's the most important of all. So if if this Red Sea doesn't get opened back up, then we're talking about the crushing of economies of nations all over the world, basically a global impoverishment because of the lack of transportability and efficiency in transport. And then what you just mentioned about Malaysia, and I think you said Indonesia as well, is
not yet Indonesia, possibly, if they follow the same track as Malaysia did.
So, this looks to me like we're going to have the fragmentation of the globe.
Don't blame the bankers, Mike. Don't blame the bankers and their bad policies and the never-ending money printing and trillions of dollars to fund our debt. That's not going to be the culprit for the collapse. The culprit will be those people over in the Middle East. See, they caused it. Again, finger point over there. Don't look at our own, mismanagement here.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then at the same time, as you know, in Europe, they're shutting down farms. And there's this push on, especially in the Netherlands and in Ireland and places, to eliminate all ranching, all meat products. And so, it's obvious. They're trying to take Europe and say, you're not allowed to produce food in Europe because producing food produces greenhouse gases, they say, or nitrogen in the case of, like cow urine. And then now they're saying nitrogen is bad. So instead, you're going to be beholden to this globalist plan, and we'll produce food somewhere in Africa, and then we'll give it to you if we like you, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and 2 points on that. So Egypt now has very little revenue coming through transit fees. So they got them by the neck, where Egypt didn't want to play ball and let all the refugees in to, resettle in the Sinai Peninsula because they're like, we don't need to. We have the money. Oh, now they don't. So if they're going to start defaulting on things, perhaps that'll be part of the pro quo is we'll pay off your debt, but you still have to take the refugees in because they got them by the neck now. Without those transit fees that they relied on so heavily, they're going to put the economy of Egypt into the grave with King Tut. And that's the whole thing about. But if you're going to tell me with a straight face that you're stopping farming because of like an extra gram of nitrogen in the soil, yet these corporate 500 companies are going to run a vessel 3,500 miles around a bottom of a continent in some of the roughest seas on the planet.
Right.
Then they need to stop all discussion of global warming or all the shipping stops. Like, you can't have it both ways here.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you and I won't be allowed to drive a car outside our 15-minute city, but they can burn, like you said, dirty bunker fuel in these ships around the southern tip of Africa, taking an extra 2 to 3 weeks of just burning fuel constantly in order to get their trinkets and goods to, the UK from wherever, from India or wherever. I mean, but like I said, it seems to me like this whole thing, the post-World War II era of U.S. naval dominance of the seas, which established the safety of these ocean lanes, like that's coming to an end, which means that all of the world's economies are going to have to be recalibrated to this. It actually means more localization of economies, which means you lose those price efficiencies. And so everything's going to become more expensive. So like if food inflation, if you thought it was bad already, or if you thought vehicle prices were bad, just wait. It's going to get a whole lot worse as we lose this international trade. But, we'll be forced to become more domestically self-reliant, which is what Russia has done since all the economic sanctions were placed on Russia. So, and actually Russia's economy is now thriving because of that. So maybe there's a silver lining to this. What do you think?
Maybe Russia was a test case to see how quickly a country could pivot if they were cut off from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Because just one thing, I've done a couple videos on rationing in World War II and what were the first things that were rationed and how much of a ration unit would you get. If we do go into a global scenario here where there are wars, food is going to be greatly rationed along with sugar, coffee, rubber, shoes, bicycles, cars. You're going to get a gamut of things. And they're going to move you over the digital rationing card to kind of fast track you into a digital ID. But once that rationing stops, perhaps they're going to leave you at a certain limit. That's all you ever get. Because control over a person, if you start with the food, I really believe in a huge amount of the factors we're seeing are related to food, because then they come into my wheelhouse of study where I'm looking at the electromagnetic anomaly coming up here somewhere in the middle of October of 2024. Not really a lot is known on the effects of what the same planetary alignment had occurred in 79 AD. Now, we know Vesuvius went off, and we know there was a lot of relocation of populace around there. A lot of, coinage of the time changed. A lot of different boundaries of what were then empires had changed right around that 30-year period. So something significant occurred, even at that time when everybody was incredibly self-sufficient. So what brings us up to a magnetic anomaly? Well, if you're going to look at this and have the world distracted as we go into something that would disrupt daily life anyway, maybe it's higher tides coming in a few days before and after the event. Maybe the tide will be 3, 4, 5 times higher and taller than it normally is, just for a few days in and a few days out of the event. But how would that wreck coastal shipping? It would take us a decade or more to clean up from that. And there's something going on here far more than just what we're being led down the news path with. There's a greater event in motion that there's a timeline against, all predicated on the sun. And we're stepping off the sun. Now, anybody who wants to do the research, I encourage you. After we're at solar maximum now, and as we come into this solar minimum off this cycle, we are heading into a grand solar minimum. Whether NASA, you can look at the NASA, European Space Agency, any of the astrophysicists, Pulkovo Observatory in Russia, by the way, and it all has the same information. We're heading into a 400-year low at the minimum of solar activity as we step off of this solar cycle. Well, one of the biggest things affected is agricultural production.
Yeah.
So for me, with all these things about the scattering of agricultural production, trying to set up new grow zones and then explaining away why we don't have enough food already because of wars, instead of pointing to the natural cycles of the sun, because they want to keep this global warming tax moving forward, that it's the nitrogen. Now I see these ridiculous articles coming out of the UK talking about the human breath has 0.1% of carbon dioxide and methane, and you fart and you burp, and now they're blaming the human for at least 0.1% of all greenhouse gases emitted. Now it's gone into bizarro land. But something is going on far greater, and the only thing I can ping it back to is this cycle we're about to roll into, electromagnetic disruptions, and then the sun stepping down into a 400-year low solar activity that would disrupt global agriculture to the point where we need to move our grow zones anywhere 45 degrees north on the planet down. Anything 45 north and above, it will go offline, or very, very minimal production compared to today.
Well, you're describing all of
hemisphere.
Western Europe right there.
Yeah, so restructure the world based on those agricultural losses alone. Then the restructuring makes a lot more sense of what's happening right now.
Right. Europe is being gutted economically and agriculturally. But what about Canada? We got to talk about that. Hold on a second. Let me mention that you have a channel on Brighteon.com. It's called Adapt 2030. I'm showing it on my screen here, Adapt 2030. And then you also have a Patreon page, or how can people find your work or support your work other than Brighteon?
Yeah, moving over to Patreon, Adapt 2030, and Subscribestar, Adapt 2030. It is about us having these discussions to find the answers, because those of our ancestors and forefathers 400 years ago, when they had to move to find better economic viability, or their crops didn't grow and they had to move to different places, it took a lot of solutions, and there was not just one solution. I talk about the problem with some possible solutions, but there's got to be 100 other solutions I've never thought of, or others haven't either, until we start the discussion. And that's the whole thing. If we can start the discussion and come together with some solutions, the movement from point A to point B through these changes that we haven't seen in centuries will be far easier. If we have the knowledge of why it's happening, perhaps we can find our own way through this and bring others along with us on the journey.
As
it's
you
about
know,
helping everybody.
The governments and the science establishment and the media, they never talk about the sun's effects on climate. It's always about climate change. As you said, they're blaming humans now. If you respirate, you're part of the problem, they say. Or if you eat meat, you're part of the problem. And it's very clear that there's never going to be an honest discussion about this, because the honest discussion takes power away from these governments that are basically bludgeoning the populations of the world with this climate change. Only the kind of people who watch this show, or alternative media-minded people, are even going to be aware of the sun's impact on climate and what's coming, the changes that are coming. I mean, most of the world's population are oblivious to this, all by design.